Doug is the executive director of Arizona Interfaith Power and Light. He's been instrumental from the very, very beginning of our Spirituality and Sustainability Initiative and the SEEK project in helping us think about how it should be structured and how to partner with faith communities effectively. He is a master storyteller. He's been involved in these issues for a long time. And he has a way of helping us get into this workshop that I think will bring together some of the different elements that we've been talking about in a creative way that really only Doug can do. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Doug.
Thanks, Ailsa. Great to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Let me give you a little bit of background so you'll understand somewhat where I'm coming from by telling you a little bit about Interfaith Power and Light. We're active here in the state of Arizona, but we've also got 40 state affiliates across the country. And we were founded about 20 years ago when we were Episcopal Power and Light in just California. And at that time, we had a grant to allow Episcopal churches to put solar panels on their roof. And then, you know, grants come and go. So that grant went, and we kept the name Power and Light. I know it sounds like a utility, but it's not. We've kept the name, even though it's a little bit anachronistic because we're not just installing solar panels. We're doing things more broadly, but we hang on to the name because we like to promote the idea that we are all the power and the light to make the earth a more friendly, healthy, just place for human beings and for the wider planet. The tagline that we used up until 6 months ago was a religious response to climate change. And then we changed it because things are changing so quickly in our culture. We changed it to a spiritual response to the climate crisis. Spiritual response rather than a religious response, because so many of our good partners are spiritual, but not religious, not a part of a organized faith tradition. And because we're all, we think, spiritual people deep down, and that's where our deepest connections can be found. So we changed it from religious to spiritual, and then we changed climate change to the climate crisis, because we think change just doesn't express the danger that we face well enough. Crisis is the language that we use now. You can see the eco-professional in the little bio there. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. It's one of the tools that I use for doing the work that I do. Yeah, I went to Home Depot and got this cardboard box and painted it mahogany brown and put armholes in it and little drapes in the front of it, and I call it my eco-professional. So I'll tell you a little story about that, since this workshop is primarily about using storytelling as a way to connect with people and bridge the differences that exist between us. So I was at a climate event, and there was a Franciscan priest there in his brown robes. I had my eco-professional on, and I've got a stack of cards that are penances that people can do. Now, I'm not Roman Catholic myself, so I've always been afraid that this approach was going to offend Roman Catholics, but so far they've taken it with a bit of humor and accepted it okay. So I've got this stack of penances, and I go up to the Franciscan priest and ask him if he would confess his ecological sin. He was willing to do so, but of course I can't tell you what he said. And then I just hand him the top card of the penances, and he looks at it, kind of sheepishly shakes his head and hands it back to me. And it says, "Shower with a partner." He said, "That's not a very good one for me," but I tell that story for several reasons. First of all, I like the ecofessional because climate change has been such a polarizing idea and reality in our culture, despite the fact that it's not so in many other countries, but it is here in the United States. And so people put their defenses up very quickly. And the ecofessional is a humorous way to approach a very serious issue of climate change. And people lower their defenses, and so that's a good approach. Humor is always a good approach. Storytelling is always a good approach, especially for a polarizing issue. The second reason I like it is because even though it's humorous, it uses the strongest language that religious traditions have to talk about our failures of our relationship, our broken relationship with each other and with the natural world. It's called sin against our neighbor, sin against the earth. So at the same time that it is very humorous, it takes it in a very profound and serious way. And the third thing I like about the ecofessional is that it gives me a good story to tell. And I think that's so important in the work that we do. We have, I believe, tried to rely too much just on the facts. We think that we human beings are rational beings, and if we just know the facts of the case, we can convince each other. And of course, we're learning that that's not true. Um, Facts don't always sway the argument. We're not just rational beings, we're also tribal beings, we're also emotional beings, and we make our decisions on those as much as we do on the technical aspects. I was glad to hear Alyssa talk about we're not just, knowledge is not just technology, it's also cultural, it's also social. I think it's also spiritual. So there are people on this call who are very capable of talking about the technology of renewable energy. They can talk about photons and electrons and kilowatt hours, and I am so grateful for them. But I'm not one of those people. So rather than talk about the technology aspects of renewable energy, I want to talk about another kind of renewable energy, and that is storytelling as a source of renewable energy. So the questions that I bring to this presentation include things like, how do we find the personal energy to do this work in the middle of the biggest pandemic that we've known in 100 years? How do we find the energy to do this and what difference it makes as we approach one of the most divisive and important elections in our nation's history? How do we find the energy? And I'm talking about the personal, spiritual, internal energy that we need to do this work when the tragic, destructive evidence of climate change, fires here in the West and hurricanes and all the things that were alluded to earlier, and their impact, especially on the most vulnerable of us, are greater than any of our models ever anticipated. How do we find the personal energy for doing this work when we're faced with political corruption, dark money, and soul-killing bureaucracy at every turn? And finally, how do we find the energy for doing this work when some days we just want to go home and binge on Schitt's Creek? The place where most of us find that personal energy is in the stories we tell about the work that we do and the life that we live. I used to think that the biggest problem that we face is climate change, and I don't think that anymore. I think climate change is just a symptom of the problem. The same is true with race. our country's being torn apart by racial divisions now. I have at times thought that that was one of the major problems we face. I think it's not. I think it's a symptom of the problems we face. Our democracy is in crisis. I used to think that that was a serious problem. I think it's just a symptom. The most serious problem we face is broken relationships. And one of the ways that we find of bridging the difference between ourselves and others and ourself and the earth is through storytelling. Before I retired and as a pastor of a church not too far from here in Tempe, we were known as the storytelling church. So we did all kinds of storytelling concerts on different themes. The last concert we did was on tattoo stories. The idea was that if somebody has a tattoo, they usually have a really good story to go with it. And that turned out to be true. But the most popular every year storytelling event that we did was called Winter's Light. So we would be getting ready for that concert now. It happens as the days are the shortest and the nights are the longest. It happens as we approach Christmas and Hanukkah and Diwali and solstice and Hanukkah, all those midwinter festivals. And we would intentionally invite storytellers that were as diverse as we could possibly find. So there were people that were all skin colors of the human family. There were people who have no doubt Biden signs in their front yard and people who were storytellers who have Trump signs in their front yards. They were gay, they were straight, they were rabbis and imams and atheists and agnostics. So a very diverse group of people that usually don't associate with each other. And if we had asked them to share their political platform or their doctrinal position, we would have ended up with something that looked like the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden. It would have been utter chaos. But instead of doing that, we asked them just to tell stories. Tell stories about sometime in your life when light came into the darkness of your life. And we found that storytelling has a way of transcending those differences that divide us. So I came away from that experience with three conclusions, or two conclusions. The first one is you can't hate someone whose story you know. And the second conclusion was the shortest distance between two people is always a story. So we use storytelling a lot in a divided culture with a hot potato issue for some, like climate change, as a way to bridge those differences. And one of the approaches that we've used, we borrowed from Marshall Gantz, G-A-N-Z. He was a student at Harvard, and this was in the 60s. So he left Harvard and went to work for the farm workers and for civil rights activists in the South. And then eventually he came back to Harvard, he got his PhD, and he started using this technique for advocacy that he called the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. So the story of self is prompted by the question, tell me about an event or an experience in your life. Could be childhood, could be young adulthood, could be adulthood. Some experience that helped shape the perspective and priorities and passions that you have for your work today, the story of self. The second story is the story of us. Who are the people that you turn to for inspiration and support when you really need it? And finally, the story of now. So why is this moment in history such an important time for us to be moving forward with the passions and priorities that you hold most dear? I think we need to remind ourselves again and again of that advocacy story, why we keep doing this work that we're doing, because we burn out otherwise, and because we need to reclaim it again and again and again. So, I'm going to tell you a story of self from my life experience. And I think most stories are autobiographical. We read a novel not just to find out what happened with the characters and what they did, but we are ourselves in that situation and we're trying to figure out, all right, what would we do if we were in that situation? So I want you to be thinking about the story of self from your own life. And maybe my story will help inspire or make you think about some of those stories from your own life. So, one of the stories of self that I tell that is really important to the work that I do is the story about my brother, Al, and myself. So, we were raised in the same home together, went to the same schools, had the same parents, same church. We watched as Ed Sullivan brought the Beatles to the United States together. We shared so much of our life as well as our genetic material. But if you imagine any continuum, whether it's religious or cultural or taste, Al's at one end and I'm at the other end. The reason we'll go to the polls on Tuesday is to make sure that we cancel each other out. So we are as different as we can possibly be. And there are days when I wonder, how can we maintain our relationship? We're so divided on so many issues. But there's one thing that brings us together. We love to go backpacking in wilderness areas, usually in Idaho, where we're from, into the Sawtooth or the White Cloud Mountains. And we climb up together to the top of this mountain, and the exertion of that and the thrill of seeing this beautiful expanse of mountains after mountains after mountains below us. And and just the exertion of sharing that physical experience together. And we always listen for a little rock rabbit, pika, that is up at that elevation that is endangered now because of a warming climate. So we hear it less often, but we hear that squeak of the rock rabbit, and that's a sign for one of us to say, the higher you get, the higher you get, the other one will say. So we sit around the campfire at night under the stars and we tell stories and we drink whiskey. And it's those experiences in the wilderness that bring us together when everything else in our lives, in our world, is um, tempted or tending to tear us apart. Um, I tell that story because it's a parable for me. Right now, climate change, climate crisis seems to be something that is tearing us apart. I'm so glad that more and more people are moving to the convinced and alarmed section, but it's still very divisive in our country. So, how do you bridge that divide? And for my brother and myself, those experiences in the wilderness bring us together. And my hope is that someday, um, care for the earth, clean air, breathable air, and clean, drinkable water, and a future for our children will be something that will bring us together as a culture, not just as two brothers together. So that's a story that I tell about why I do the work that I'm doing. So the technical people that are running this Zoom call, if you can allow anyone who wants to tell a story about why you do the work that you're doing, what influences from your childhood, your youth, your adulthood, um, caused you to want to have this passion for renewable energy and for caring for the earth? So if anybody is able to tell, 30-second story, just a little snippet, anecdote from your life, let me open it to anyone who wants to do so.
Okay, let me jump in and help here. This is going to take a little bit of technological gymnastics. I'm going to encourage people to do a couple things. The chat should be enabled for everyone participating. So you can certainly type in the chat a response to Doug's question. And otherwise, if you would like to, we can try. If you would like to unmute yourself and just leap into the void with your story, we can give that a try as well and see how that works out. And just mention your first name if you do unmute.
Any volunteers?
Good morning, this is Kelly from Texas.
Yeah, go ahead.
My 60-second elevator speech is, I'm the Army brat, and I live across both oceans, Germany and Japan. It was only when in Japan, when we were there from 88 to 91, this is during the Montreal protocol, and I learned more about hairspray. And as you know, late 80s, a lot of hairspray going on as well. I participated. But being an Army brat and being a Christian from the Midwest, I saw a different culture. I saw a different life. And at that time, you can only see Mount Fuji one time a year due to all the smog. Now, to a middle schooler, this was mind-boggling. So at that moment, that is when I realized what I need to do. And here it is, almost 30 years later, I am an environmentalist. I have my degrees in environmental, and I'm a Christian, and I'm focused on this. I'm a federal employee, I'm an environmentalist for your feds. So I'm excited just to be part of the solution, and that was my moment.
Thank you. Great story. You have a picture of Mount Fuji on your wall somewhere?
Actually, I have my my Mount Fuji cane, or my stick, in my living room, where I climbed it.
Great. Any other stories of self?
I don't have a story of myself, but I just think it's part of me. I mean, I just raised and
Wait, I'm sorry. The person who's speaking, can you increase your volume a little bit or go closer to your microphone? Can we give that one a try again?
Is that better?
Oh, much better. Yes, please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Put on another mic. I don't have a story so much about myself as much as I think it's in my DNA. Although I was raised in a city, we spent a lot of time outdoors camping and hiking when I was a child, and it's always been part of me. So, I mean, to me, this is so much a part of me that I don't even have a moment that I can say, this is the moment. And I'm wondering if other people feel the same way.
Good question. Thank you. I'm surprised at the number of times that those experiences and events came from childhood, and just being outside is what developed for us a love for the natural world. Well, let me move on in the interest of time to the story of us and say just a little bit about that. So the story prompt is, and let me check with time. Do we have about 5 more minutes?
We can take 5 more minutes. Yep.
Okay. The story of us, the prompt is, who are the kindred spirits? Who are the people that you turn to in times of need, crisis, for inspiration and support? So like many of us, I find myself during the pandemic needing to go outside and go for a hike, go for a walk in town or out into the desert. And one of the deep places of solace for me is in the Aspens up near Flagstaff. So this was another hiking trip, and I had an encounter with a couple aspen trees that I ended up cutting to make walking sticks, and gave one to my wife for Christmas after etching it and sanding it and putting a leather thong through the top and a turquoise bead. And these two aspen walking sticks lean against each other in the corner of our bedroom at the head of the bed. When I cut those trees, I thought they were separate trees, but you may know that aspen are actually a one tree grove. They share not only the same air and the same water, but the same genetic material, because they're clones of each other. And that's actually true for all of us, that we share not just the same water, the same air, but also the same genetic material. My brother that I mentioned earlier doesn't like the idea that, we may have evolved from earlier forms of creatures. So he's got a bumper sticker on the back of his truck that says, my grandpa was not a monkey. So I tell him that, we share genetic material with many other creatures. I try to comfort him. I tell him, listen, we share not only 97% of our DNA with the chimpanzee, but we share 50% of our DNA with the banana. So get over it. And it's a story for me about how we're deeply connected with each other. St. Francis talked not just about being stewards of creation, but of being kin with creation. So we talked about brother wolf and sister dove, and how we're brothers and sisters and to each other. And the other source of inspiration that I find is from young people like Greta Thunberg and the Sunrise Movement. And whenever I get discouraged, they're the ones that give me hope for the future. So, and I've got a story to tell about some young people. I'll give you just a thumbnail sketch. This was in Utah, and Mrs. Bloomquist's 4th grade class. So when they came to class on the first day, Mrs. Bloomquist had made this poster with a paper mache globe that says, "You can change the world." And 4th grade, is when you learn about state history, and they learned that state motto for Utah was industry, and the state tree was the Colorado blue spruce. And they said, why do we have a tree from another state? And Mrs. Bloomquist told them about Pando populus. It's this aspen grove not far from that school that scientists say may be the biggest and the oldest organism on Earth, 80,000 years old. So they start saying, we should have the aspen tree for our state tree. But how can a group of 4th graders make a change like that in state government? But they start doing research, and they start writing to politicians. And eventually they catch the ear of the governor, and there's a representative who graduated from that same elementary school years before. He has a granddaughter named Aspen. And so he writes a bill, and it gets presented to the Senate. And on the day when it's debated in the Senate, this group of fourth graders gets taken to a bus to Salt Lake City, where they hear the debate and hear the Senate pass the bill. And eventually it gets signed into law. The governor came to that elementary school, sat on a Aspen chair at an Aspen desk, and signed the bill into law with his Aspen pen. And when the representative who wrote the bill, or the senator, spoke to the kids, he said, every time we see the aspens change their color, we will remember the change we brought. And I think about those young people today. You know, they were fourth graders at the time, but today, having had that experience of influencing the political machine to be responsive to their desires, I wonder if they're activists today. And so that story and those fourth graders give me hope for the future. I hope you're thinking about your own stories of us and the people that give you inspiration. But thank you for the time, and I'll turn it back to the people running the webinar.
Okay, thank you so much, Doug. That was an amazing way to start us off. And I just want to make a couple of observations or a couple of comments here as we close. We called this introduction, this opening session, Climate Crises and Rational Hope. And the reason for that is, if you look at just the scientific predictions, and if you hold yourself to the feelings of anxiety and grief that those things can create, if you look at the destruction of places that we love, if you think in terms of the natural world and the world that our parents grew up with and that some of us knew as children being in danger or under some kind of threat, it can feel overwhelming and be quite difficult to figure out how to find that renewable energy to continue and to find solutions and to believe that there is a future, to believe that there is a future worth living where there's thriving and resilience going on. And I think that Doug's stories, both in the granularity of his personal stories and the overarching notion of storytelling being a great integrator, and what did he call it, the shortest line, the shortest distance between two people, really is true, and it resonates through history. And it's a deep understanding about how people think, about how they learn, about new ideas, about how they find their place in the world, and about how they create a cohesive understanding between them. And so this idea of rational hope is not the kind of hope that, to go back to something that Doug mentioned about sin, it's not the kind of hope where we expect to be saved by some external force. It's the kind of a hope that we build by understanding and embracing the challenges that are before us as our collective project, which requires us to be inclusive, to, with honesty and a real interest, learn from each other about our perspectives, about the knowledges that we bring, about the potential for working with each other, about building the relationships that Doug was talking about. And from that, in the same way that he was talking about he and his brother climbing to the top of mountains and sharing that exhilaration and the experience of being out in nature and just being in that place together, that is where some of the solutions will come from. It's from finding ourselves in those sorts of relationships, in those kinds of locations with each other and with the world, that will help us develop ideas about how to create conditions under which thriving can occur for us and for the world around us. And with that frame of mind, I hope we can go into the sessions that are before us today. The first two are about energy stewardship and the ethics of care. And the concurrent session is about the science and ethics of direct climate interventions. Those sessions will go on for about 45 minutes. The tail end of that session will be an open time, the last 10 minutes or so, for you to, if you need to take a break to go get something to drink or eat or take care of some personal business, you can do that. You can take that time for informal discussion within your group because the breakout room will remain open. And also to sign up for some next step activities that are on the website in case you would like to do that. With that, Cindy, I think we are ready to go into the first set of breakouts.